Welcome to Weird Hill to Die On, where we tackle life's big mysteries, untangle theological spaghetti, and attempt to navigate faith without existential meltdowns. I'm Mary Jo Sharp, and today's hill is blind faith, a concept that's been memed to death. Look, we're not Amazon Prime. We can't deliver you neatly boxed answers in 24 hours. Faith is messy. Humans are walking contradictions. And honestly, some hills aren't even speed bumps. But following Jesus, yeah, that's a ride that's still worth buckling in for. So if you're here to question boldly, spiral existentially, and entertain ideas that live outside your echo chamber, congrats, you've found your tribe. Hit subscribe, forward this to a friend who's allergic to small talk, and let's dive in. In this episode, we explore how the rich biblical tradition of faith got flattened into a vague idea of spiritual vibes over substance. We'll uncover why this shallow view is a tragic misunderstanding of Jesus's teaching and highlight how authentic, rooted faith deeply engages both mind and will. We're challenging bad theology, dismantling cultural clichés, and discussing the age-old tension between faith and reason. If you've ever felt like faith meant checking your brain at the door, this one's for you. I'm not tackling this alone. I've got Phoenix Hayes and Adam Coleman here to keep things interesting. These guys bring sharp insights, spicy snark, meme collections of questionable taste, and just enough theological muscle to help us navigate the chaos. What's up, guys?
What up?
Hey, hey.
I'm glad you're both here. This topic needs all the help it can get. Faith conversations can get awkward. And on one hand, there's that cringeworthy, like eye roll moment when someone dismissively tells you you just need to have more faith. And on the other, there's that uncomfortable silence after you mention that you're a Christian, as if faith itself is inherently suspect. So let's kick things off right here. When you hear the phrase blind faith, what's your gut reaction? You can personally, theologically, culturally, however you want to take that. What's your gut reaction?
Well, my gut reaction is lazy.
Oh.
Yeah. That's on me. I need to be a bit more charitable, but when I hear, well, you're supposed to just have faith, I think this person doesn't know. This person doesn't want to know. This person is scared. So there's like a lack of knowledge about what real faith calls us to do. There's a lack of effort to actually dive in and find that out. And I probably for me, I always think there's a justification to laziness there. Like I don't have to dive in because I have faith. So not a lot of positive reactions on my end. How about you, Adam?
I wish I could even it out, but I was gonna say as far as the gut level reaction, like queasiness, nausea, it just kind of it feels like a brick in my stomach. You know what I mean? It's just something. I would say trying to be charitable. I think that maybe uninformed, well intentioned but uninformed. I
Yeah.
think people at the end of the day they're trying to follow Christ as best they can, and they're under the mistaken impression that that means that you just kind of have to believe stuff without there being any reason whatsoever. And so I think just kind of mistaken. I mean, yes, we want to believe God. Yes, we affirm that His word is true, even in areas where we don't entirely have understanding. We can, in principle, affirm that it's true. But also, we shouldn't check our brains at the door, when it comes to following Christ. So yeah.
Yeah.
That's right. I think anyone that is that agreeable with a God, even if it's the God I worship too, which is great, I think anyone who's just going to be that agreeable with a concept without challenging it and without diving into it could just as easily be swayed by pursuing Allah or pursuing Buddha but you know what I mean? So
Ah.
I'm glad they agree with God, but if they haven't actually looked into it, what tomorrow it could be someone else. Yeah.
And, honestly, I would
Yeah.
say to that too. Actually, I think most people who may say that they hold to some form of blind faith, I don't think that they really do. Actually, I think many of them tend to be the types where they've had some experiences with God that they believe to be so compelling that they may not need quote unquote intellectual reasons for following the faith, but they do have reasons. It's just experiential, which can be
Yeah.
reason giving, in of themselves. So I think most people who would affirm
Yeah.
that they hold to some sort of blind faith, they actually really don't in real practice.
Ah, yeah.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
fair. That's
That's a good
fair. And
point.
if that's the case, I respect that actually. I respect that
Yeah.
more than just nothing. Yeah.
Yeah, you guys took both the side of like a believer who says this. For me, the when I hear blind faith, I think of a person who's not a believer saying it. And
Mm.
so to me, my reaction is like, oh yeah, I used to think that. I used to think that it was a crutch that people used. Faith was a crutch that people used. So it was becoming more informed. Like I heard Adam mention that, becoming more informed myself on what the Christian tradition uh, says about faith really helped me understand that it isn't a blind faith. And growing up with my major influence in Christianity being Hollywood and
Yeah,
television
yeah.
series, it's like that's how they portrayed it. You just got to have faith.
Yeah.
So uh
That is very true.
that was kind of what my gut reaction was. So we're going to take this and we're going to zoom out a bit. This idea that faith equals switching off your brain.
Mm.
Where do you think that came from? Was it always baked into the church culture? Is this more of a pop culture slash the Enlightenment slash TikTok evangelical phenomenon? What's the origin story here? How did biblical faith and the Christian philosophical framework or tradition get flattened into a meme?
First of all, I'm not a church historian, so I'm just kind of, talking off the cuff here. I can't give a qualified answer. But what I am curious about, though, is that throughout church history, there was this period where it seems like the scriptures and kind of intellectually engaged in faith was kind of sequestered in just like the ivory tower, if you will, of the church world. Unless you were a monk or something like that, you just really weren't engaging with the scriptures themselves. Thinking about particularly like with the Catholic Church, there was just like this barrier between the common man and just the intellectual side of the faith, maybe. And then with the Enlightenment period, you do have those doors kind of being open to the public, but not with any level of care. Like, there was no way to bring the common
Yeah.
man into the intellectual conversation, which is like, hey, here you go. You guys can read the scriptures now. And so I think maybe, and again, I'm just kind of my theory. Like maybe that's where there was a turning point, where you turn the intellectual side of the faith over to folks who maybe just aren't accustomed to it, and they're just trying to digest whatever they can, and then maybe some of the intellectual side kind of got left behind. You know, that's not totally ahistorical, but
Yeah.
well, not totally, but I'm just guessing right now. But
That's really interesting. So I definitely think there's a journey that you can follow through church history that got us there. But then of course your typical churchgoer doesn't know any of that. They just know the idea of having faith that's rooted in the heart, not the mind, or hasn't been fact checked is a virtue. That was the impression I had growing up, particularly coming from a very charismatic word of faith background where verses are plucked out of context and you really are taught persuasively that, for example, doubting Thomas. Don't be like Thomas. That's the message. Don't be like Thomas.
yeah.
And because Jesus is reprimanding him for, you're blessed because you've seen my wounds, but people will be more blessed for believing without seeing my wounds. And that can be taken more than one way. And the general way, I think, in today's church culture is don't be like Thomas. You get more props for just blind faith. Whereas I don't think that's actually what Christ meant. I think he was telling people, you're blessed because you actually got to be here. People who have confidence in me and just have this level of faith and a surety without having to be here, they're blessed. That's because it's rare, it's unusual, but we weren't there, but we have records of what happened.
When you talk about it, it reminds me of a couple of things. One is that when you talk about Thomas, I mean, he had empirical evidence verify his faith that Jesus was God, right? He's there. He gets
Yeah.
to see it, he gets to feel it, he gets to, his senses are present. So when you talk about empirical
Mm,
verification, according to David Hume and the Enlightenment, what happened there, yeah, Thomas is actually seeing it. But remember, there's the centurion who sent his servant to Jesus and said, hey, I've got a servant who's very ill, and I trust that you without being present with you, from what I know of you, I trust that you can heal my servant because you have authority
Mm,
to do so. And so I think that's kind of what you're
yeah.
talking about. Like Jesus responds like,
Yeah.
I have not seen greater faith in all of Israel. Like this guy gets it.
Right.
So I think that's
Yeah.
kind of what you're talking about with Thomas, if I'm hearing you right.
Yeah, maybe this is something we need to tease out a bit better because so many people take that as, oh, the guy who just trusted without question is better. And it's like, well, hold up. It wasn't without question.
Yeah.
He had already ascertained this man is not just a man and he can do amazing things.
I think that kind of resonates with me 'cause I came up in a word of faith, background as well, and every time that Thomas is brought up, it's the doubting Thomas, like he should have believed, which yeah, he should have, but to your point, it's always like you don't need to question anything, you don't need to ask any questions, just believe. That's kind of what people get out of that passage. Where I don't think that's what Christ was intending
Yeah.
to communicate.
Yeah.
Obviously, you're right. I
Yeah.
mean, Thomas had a front row seat to years, at least 3 years or so of miracles, and Jesus telling the disciples essentially who he was, and so on and so forth. So, and the other disciples around him that he'd been walking with 4 years, saying, "Look, we just saw the guy." So given
Yeah.
the epistemic framework that he was in, context that he was in, he had justification to affirm that Jesus rose from the dead, and yet he didn't. I think it was more so about the
Mm,
heart posture, is that he was inclined to not believe,
mm,
as opposed to whether or not he believed.
mm,
Yeah, that's really good. There's some translations of that passage where Thomas is saying, "Unless I put my, like finger in the holes and my hand in the side, I will never believe." So there's this
mm,
a sense of if you don't meet the level of criteria that I have set for myself, if you won't meet
yeah.
that, I won't believe. And it reminds me
Right.
of people who say, more modern thinkers who say things like, well, why doesn't God just put a shining cross of stars in the sky? Why doesn't he just announce himself? And so it's like if you don't meet my level of criteria, then I won't ever believe you.
There
That's
you go.
fascinating, MJ, because actually, if with that being the case, I think it's interesting because actually Thomas would have already been exposed to Jesus' teachings, which went against that heart
Right.
posture, right? Because he would have known that Jesus said to the Pharisees, an evil generation seeks after a sign and so forth. Like, so like this kind of heart posture of, unless God does this magic trick or whatever, then I'm not going to believe. Like, Thomas would have already been exposed to Jesus addressing that. And so all the more he'd be accountable to not fall into that category. So that's interesting. I think it makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
Mm,
Yeah. I think you got it right with the heart posture. I think people have to keep in mind, and I teach on this as well. It's that we like to think that it's this like lab coated scientist objective experience. I'm going to look at the facts and I'm just going to leave my entire emotional intelligence out of it and all my desire and will out of it. And I'm just going to investigate whether this happened or not. That is not what's going on. Nobody can do that.
right.
Right. Right.
Yeah. No one
Nobody.
can do
Right.
that.
Right.
Yeah.
So that was like the product of the 20th century and previous, leading up to that is this sort of scientism that I can, look at things just through empirical verification. And there's no, it's that sense of that white lab coated scientist. I'm just looking at facts. And it's like
Mhm.
that's a myth of the 20th
Yeah.
century
Right.
that I hope
Yeah,
is
yeah.
slowly going away.
Yeah, and I think this kind of speaks to the version of the problem of evil when it comes to supposed divine hiddenness. And I think that often we're just not really good judges of what's in our heart. Yeah, I think that's just the reality of it. And so you have the person that says, "Well, no, I'm just this, impartial, observer, and if I had enough, evidence, then I would believe, but God hasn't provided me with that." It's like, no, it could be that the omniscient ruler of the universe may very well know that there actually is no level of evidence that would convince you. Like, perhaps you're sitting with a heart posture inclined toward unbelief, and not just unbelief as in affirming that God is real, but like the kind of belief as in committing oneself to Christ. Like, it very well might be that you have a heart posture that's inclined against that, and the omniscient God of the universe knows that, and so therefore He's not under no obligation to jump through your hoops. Like, that would be crazy, right?
Right.
So
Okay, we're going to bring Jesus into this groundbreaking move. I realize. Actually, honestly, we have already brought Jesus into this, but there's a fun fact about Jesus, which is he's not out here handing out gold stars for uncritical belief. Like, really, he's not. So when I say that, like, what are some examples that you can think of where Jesus is actually encouraging critical thinking or pointing people to evidence rather than demanding a blind trust or this blind faith that we're talking about?
Oh, yeah, well, I mean, that's all 4 of the Gospels, right? Like, I mean, when Jesus enters into, human history, I mean, we're talking about centuries of this particular people group having prophecies and historical events that are all pointing toward what the Messiah is gonna look like. You have all these neon signs throughout the Old Testament. So when Jesus is showing up and he's like, healing people and he's doing this and he's doing that, like, he's just harkening back to those neon signs of the Old Testament. So, like, for example, like when John the Baptist is about to be beheaded, he's in jail, he's feeling discouraged, and he sends some messengers to Jesus, like, "Hey, are you the Messiah or not?" Right? And then Jesus tells the disciples to those disciples to go back to John and say, "Hey, tell John that the blind are seeing and the lame are being healed and so on and so forth." Like, what he didn't say, tell John, "Yes, I'm the Messiah, and just take my word for it." He pointed to the evidence. These are the things that
Yeah.
one would expect the Messiah to do. Go tell John, this is stuff that I'm doing. This is the proof that's in the pudding that I am indeed the Messiah, right? And so Jesus' whole
Yeah.
ministry revolves around essentially picking up on those neon signs, those breadcrumbs that Yahweh had left throughout the Old Testament, and saying to those people that are present with him there in the first century, "Hey, I'm the guy. You've been looking for the guy. It's me." I mean, even on the cross, right? I'm gonna mispronounce it. Eloi, Eloi, some sabachthani, whatever. Lord, Lord, why have you forsaken me? Right? I mean, he's quoting Psalm
Sure.
22. And if you read Psalm 22, it's going through all of these different things that are happening to him right at that time, including, people casting lots for his clothing and so on and so forth. So he's saying like, "Hey, I'm the guy." All of these passages that have been, talked about, they're talking about me. So I think Jesus is constantly appealing to evidence, like both in word and in deed. That was literally the entirety of what he did during his earthly ministry.
I mean, you really are hitting it there because, like, with the John the Baptist story, it really is impacting because it's John the Baptist who has this question: "Are you the one who is to come, or should we look for another?" This is Luke 7 in verses 20 through 28. That's that story. And here you have so many layers to this because you've got the prophesied messenger of the Messiah asking the Messiah if he's the Messiah. Or should we look for another? So there's something going on there. And when you think about, yeah, of course, there's something going on. He's in jail and he's about to be beheaded. He doesn't know that, but it ends really badly for him.
Right, right,
But what does he do? He doesn't just give evidence and reason, which he does. It says in that hour, like you were saying, he healed many people. So he gives that empirical verification. This is who I am. This is what I have the power to do. Then he reasons, like you were talking about from the Old
Yeah.
Testament. And this is what the coming Messiah was supposed to do.
right.
So he gives that reason and evidence. And then he says, now go tell John what you've seen and heard. And then turns around and tells the crowd, now I'm going to defend John. Right? Like, so what did you expect from John? What do you think he is? I love this passage so much for all the reasons you were discussing.
That's powerful.
But I want to give Phoenix a chance to
Hmm.
jump in. We were talking about examples where Jesus actually showed that he cares about evidence and reason and not just telling people, hey, blindly trust me.
The story of Thomas's encounter with him comes to mind again because he didn't just put his hands on his hips and say, "Go away, you sinner," to Thomas. He understands, man, this guy is vulnerable right now. He doesn't know what to do with the fact that I've gone. He should know what to do because I told him I was going to die and come back. But okay, humans are dumb. That's why I'm here to save him. And he steps in and says, "Here, here, touch them, touch my wrist, touch my side. I'm here." And that just warms my heart so much that he didn't say, "You don't need evidence. A true believer wouldn't need that. Get out." And Jesus told people to get out, when they were doing something stupid. Um, but he doesn't do that to Thomas. He says, "Okay, here, look, touch."
Yeah. And there's, you guys are touching on such great stuff. And there's so many passages like the Mark 5 passage where the paralytic is healed. And Jesus actually tells the audience what's easier to tell the man your sins are forgiven
Yes.
or to heal him like in front of you.
Right,
And he says, so that you may know I have the power to forgive sins, I'm going to heal this guy right in front of you. Like, so he says, I'm going to give you
Mm.
evidence. Right? And it's weird because it's the kind of evidence that the 20th century was demanding. Like, I wanna see it. I wanna have it in front of me. I wanna be able to experience it, and that's the kind of evidence he's giving as well. "Okay, here we go," you know? So, he does give that, and he
Mm.
actually says, "If you don't believe me," I think it's Mark 10, then, "If you don't believe my words, then believe the miracles.
Right.
Believe the
Mm.
evidence."
Right.
Yeah.
So, he tells you
Yeah.
that.
That's right.
Well,
Yeah.
what's interesting to me is that, going back to your point about the Roman centurion, like, what was it that he was seeing or hearing about Jesus that prompted him to believe like that? Or even the Roman soldiers where Jesus is being crucified, one looks up and is like, surely he was the son of God. Like what were they seeing? They saw something. It wasn't just some random epiphany. There were, essentially God demonstrated himself to the folks of that generation in such a way they had reason to believe. It wasn't a blind faith ministry, right?
Right.
Mm. Right.
Okay, so on that note, Hebrews 11:1, classic verse, but commonly misunderstood. So I'm going to read it real quickly and have you guys comment on it. It starts with, now faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. For by it the people of old received their condemnation. Faith we understand, but by faith, boy, I'm butchering this. By faith, by faith we understand that the universe was created by the word of God, so that what is seen was not made out of things that are visible. Okay, so now going
Mm.
back to that first passage, that first verse. Now, faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. How should we read this? Faith as the assurance or the substance of things hoped for, the evidence or conviction of things not seen. Is this pro blind faith or is it something else?
No, I was so I think
Uh,
there's a couple things going on here actually, in this passage. So on the one hand, if you look at the entire um chapter, right? Which is important, right? When you're looking at a verse, you want to think about the context. Essentially, the author here is trying to give the audience essentially a history lesson, right? And so it's basically like, I've already given you 10 chapters of how Jesus relates to the old covenant. I know you guys are under pressure right now. Let me give you a history lesson of what God has done. And then I'm going to, in chapter 12, affirm you so you can have confidence in what God is going to do, right? So that's really what chapter 11, really, chapter 11 is just a set of evidence that's meant to convince the people at that time, hey, you've got good reason to stand in faith in what God is doing in you right now, right? That's the purpose of chapter 11.
Yeah.
With that
Mhm.
being said, I think that again, coming from that word of faith background, like it was read as the, oh yeah, you just gotta have blind faith, you just gotta believe. I think there's actually more going on. I think that that word faith is kind of infused with this notion of faithfulness, right? Because if you look at the examples that are given throughout the chapter, it's, so and so, Abraham faith, and then he departed to go to a land that he didn't know of, or Noah or Moses had faith, and then he did this. This person had faith, and then they did that. It's just associating faith with action throughout the chapter, right? And so I think what's going on is that really it's not talking about some sort of blind faith, but more so like faithfulness on the basis of who God is and who you know him to be and what he said he's going to do. We ought to act accordingly. We ought to demonstrate that or live out that kind of faith with action. I think that's really what it's trying to convey.
yeah. Phoenix, you want to add to that?
Yeah. I hear it in a similar sense that, for example, when he says confidence and faith in God who created the universe, it's like we have the tangible evidence that this universe had to be created. It's a logical conclusion. Of course, naturalists will say it wasn't created, but it was burst forth from nothing, which of course makes no sense even on their way of reasoning. But we're not allowed to address that because then the question goes to, well, what and the who? Well, the confidence for us is the who is God. And when you put your faith in the who, there's a whole bunch of other baggage connected to that, which, the naturalist doesn't want to consider.
Yeah. So I'm hearing from both of you like there's deductive reasoning as to why in that passage that God was the creator of all things and he's the necessary being at the origin of the universe, the uncaused cause. And then I'm hearing from Adam that there was evidence And that's what he's reminding of them through this history lesson. So that's good. You're bringing together. That's kind of how I see it. Like that's how I see Hebrews 11 is he's bringing together all of this information to say there's actually good reason here to trust. And that's I think that's kind of where people mistake faith. They mistake it as like a blind leap in the dark, the Indiana Jones thing, where you just put your hand over your heart and you hope it's true. Whereas faith is more like trust in Christianity, where you do have reason to believe. You got to take that next step and trust.
Yeah, when I think about that, actually, I might just bring it up right quick, just because there's something particular I wanted to
Go
say
ahead.
about that. I guess it's okay. We read the Bible during our podcast, right? I probably
You
listen
want to
to
bring
that here,
Jesus into this
right? um,
and the scriptures. Let's go.
yeah, right.
Do it.
Uh, yeah, what was the part? It says, now now without faith, it is impossible to please God. This is verse 6. Now, without faith, it is impossible to please God, since one who draws near to him must believe that he exists and that he rewards those who seek him. And so, kind of what I'm getting at there is like,
Yeah.
there is this sense in which, like, it's not just faith in like what God will do or that something particular will happen, but really it's about a confidence in God himself that he exists. And it also says something
Yeah.
about his character. That he's a rewarder of those who seek him. Yeah, it's a type of confidence that I think is being touched upon there. But
Yeah.
yeah, I really want to, yeah, I really resonate with what Phoenix was saying earlier. Like in the word of faith circles, I mean, it's never taught that way. It's always taught that faith is like this kind of muscle that if you exercise it, it'll get you out of every problem or that you have, and that's just not what that passage is talking about. Yeah, yeah, essentially,
Right?
yeah.
Right? Because if we remind ourselves that Job is also a book of the Bible, we're like, "Oh, yeah, you don't just get out of this, scot-free, that there is suffering in this life." And, yeah, we gotta remind ourselves of the connection, like, the Bible is fully connected, right? Don't just take like you said, don't read it out of context, put it back in its setting, in its home, and I think when you look at Hebrews and you think about what's going on there, you're looking at a time when Christianity was, and Christians were persecuted. They're not living in 21st century or 20th century or 18th century America, right? This is a very different time with a very different culture. And so this is an encouragement in part to trust God from what he's done and like you said from also who he is.
Well, to that point, actually, if you hop down to yeah, after kind of like this, like history lesson, kind of on the tail end of it, if you get to verse 35, right? I'll start at verse 36. This is the same chapter. This is chapter 11. It says, others experienced mockings and scourgings, as well as bonds and imprisonment. They were stoned. They were sawed in two. They died by the sword. They wandered about in sheepskins and goatskins, destitute, afflicted, and mistreated. The world was not worthy of them. They wandered in deserts and on mountains, hiding in caves, on holes in the ground. Now, I can assure you, in all my years of being in the Word of Faith movement, hearing Hebrews chapter 11, verse 1 being taught, nobody ever went over to verse 36. Nobody ever went to talk about how these same people in this hall of faith, so to speak, some of them in that hall of faith endured the various persecutions like that it outlined there, right? And so it's
Yeah.
faith is not on this like get out of suffering free card. That's not what it is. There's more going on here than, "Oh, if I just believe blindly, if I just, mentally assent to that things are gonna be okay, then some kind of way I'm gonna be able to, just float above all earthly struggles." No, actually, there's faithfulness. That's really what this is getting at. It's about faithfulness. Like, no matter, what happens, I believe who God is, I believe his character, and I'm gonna stand steadfast in the midst of whatever comes.
Yeah. Yeah. And I'm so glad you're pointing this out because sometimes we get accused as apologists or like, Christian academics or thinkers that overstress rationality, right? We stress it so much. And this aspect of assent to propositional truths that we're missing, the emotional intelligence, the relational intelligence, the maturing in
Mhm,
Christ.
mhm.
And I think what you've just talked about is really helpful on that end, as to helping us see that it's not a either or, that we have we're supposed to grow in our relash relational.
Rational.
That's relational. I've just made a new word.
You're right. Right.
It's relational
Rationale.
and rational.
Relational. I can dig.
And as I'm making a new word up, Phoenix has joined us, it looks like from her phone.
Yeah,
So
I
she's gonna be with us.
I've given up. I got mad, so I'm like, I'm using my phone. This is too annoying.
Great solution, great
All right.
solution. We kind of enjoyed having you pop in and out. It was kind of fun
Oh
for a
yeah.
while, but glad you
We
glad you're
should have
back.
took a bet on how many times she was going to pop in and out, just to kind of see who would win that.
Oh,
That's an
man.
opportunity.
We missed out on that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so I'm gonna shift it a little from, Hebrews 11, and, we talked about Acts 17 before, but specifically talk to me a little bit about, Paul praising the Bereans, um, for fact checking him.
Mm.
Basically, he's praising them. Um, I know that you two both know this passage. It's Acts 17:11. So just talk to me a little bit about that. Uh, in addition to what we've been saying, what tell me about how you feel about that. Tell me what you think about Paul praising these Bereans after he preached to them.
Well, I think for him, it was a relief because he was dealing with so many churches gone awry and forming these heretical doctrines that were close to what he was trying to get spread across, the Near East at the time. But he kept encountering people who had it close, but not quite. So I think it was a relief for him. Like, oh, thank goodness, these guys are asking the right questions to so I'm not gonna have to send a letter to them later, right? And get them back on track.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's good.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I think in addition to that, Paul and the apostles, I think they set an interesting precedent for believers to follow later down in later generations, namely that the scriptures is what really matters, right? It doesn't matter who's come
Yeah.
to you, and said whatever. We should always weigh a teaching, against the word of God, right? And so when you think about the church fathers who come along in like the second, third centuries and on forward, like how are they resolving questions about canonization? How are they resolving questions about the divinity of Christ and Trinity and all these different things, what is going to be the basis upon which these matters are resolved? And again, I think the apostles set the bar that it's the scriptures. What has God revealed through his word? That's the way that we're going to adjudicate
Yeah.
what's true, the real from the fake, if you will. And so he highlights the
Mhm.
Bereans of like, look, I'm not expecting you to just let me walk in the door, say what I want to say, and then you take my word for it. No, like you need to investigate. Like, don't check your brain at the door or whatever. You need to investigate. See if these things are true. And so
Yeah.
I think that this actually flies in the face of this kind of accusatory vibe of blind faith that many times atheists levy against Christians. Like blind faith has never been a mark of Christianity, a real mark of a Christian. That's never been the case.
Yeah. Okay, so I'm gonna give you one last section here to kind of share with me a little bit lighter, which is what are the worst faith cliches that you've heard, either from Christians or critics? And if you need a hot second to think, I've got one on tap.
Okay, yeah, go because at the moment all I can think of is just have faith. I mean, that's the cliche in itself. But no, go on. What's yours?
Adam, did you think of one?
Yeah, actually, it's funny enough. So it actually comes from Hebrews chapter 11 again. 11 verse 1 again in those kind of word faith circles. If you just read it, says, "Now faith is the reality of what is hoped for, the proof of what is not seen." Like, I've heard people preach a whole message off of those 2 words, "now faith." He was like, "Now faith." Like, you gotta have faith that God is gonna do such and such right now. And they'll preach a whole message on now faith, the now kind of faith. And that's clearly not what the author of Hebrews is intending to do there. He's just saying he's talking about a subject and he's switching, he's kind of pivoting a bit in terms of what he's talking about. He says now such and such, such and such. It's not the now in that passage is not temporal. It's more so just transitional from what he was talking about before to what he was talking about in chapter 11. But yeah, I've seen, I can't tell you how many times I've seen somebody preach off of now faith. They just read those 2 words and then don't even look at the Bible for like the rest of the sermon. That's a real thing. That's a real thing.
Wow. I didn't know that. I didn't know any of that
Oh
because
yeah.
my background is naturalist and atheist. So, like, I don't have a vibe on what was going on in all these different types of churches. So,
Yeah, it's a
that's a,
thing.
that's a good one. Phoenix, did you gather one up already, or do you want me to go?
Uh, I mean, again, that word of faith background is the whole concept of just naming and claiming, and then also the counter side of speaking negativity will bring negativity. Like that. That's
Mm,
how I had no idea how powerful my words were. My father died of liver cancer, but I remember him specifically saying to me, "I what like I am being treated for cancer." But he would never say, "I have cancer," as if saying, "I have
Uh,
cancer," would give the devil a foot in the door. That's how
yeah,
powerful it was.
wow.
Yeah. So it's just the power of what people think they can bring about with their words is a real problem. Yeah. And of
yeah,
course, it's based in scripture, but it's not correct interpretation of scripture, right? Yeah.
right.
Yeah. Yeah. So mine, of course, that's great. I'm glad that you guys
Real.
brought it from the church. Again, mine's from my atheist background, but it's Mark Twain's saying, "Faith is believing what you know ain't so."
Oh,
Mm,
nice. Uh-huh.
right. Yep.
Yeah, and I hear a lot of that, like, as I over the years on my various channels of, like, Facebook groups and debate groups and such, I got a lot of that. "Well, it's not faith if you have evidence," and I'm like, "Well, that's not now you're out of Christianity." Like, I don't know what that is, but Christianity is a faith, that is based in evidence and reason as well as trust, and so, sometimes I go back into the medieval expression of faith as knowledge and agreement and trust. And that's, hearing Mark Twain, those kind of people were very influential throughout those kind of sayings because those are great writers, those are great thinkers. And it makes you pause and go, oh, wait, if you have a background where, like you guys are talking about, where you're just supposed to say it and it comes true, Mark Twain sounds pretty you know, good in that scenario. Like, wait a minute, maybe I should be listening to this guy. But then the way he frames faith is so, even though he's a great thinker, even though he was a great writer, that framing of faith is very uninformed, and or it's very pejorative. So I'm wondering, like, how influential has he been? Because I was even a person that thought, okay, the faith is for the people who need it,
Yeah.
rather than it's a the Christian philosophical framework is coherent and consistent and makes sense and can be reasoned to. And, you know, I was just hearing faith is believing in what you know ain't so.
I mean, to be honest, I do think that there's a connection there because in my experience, and this is somewhat anecdotal, but I mean, I do know people who came up in the circles that I was in that where they had that kind of magic wand rendition of what they thought faith was. And then eventually what happens is life, we all experience sufferings one way or the other. And when you can't faith your way out of it, then for some people the next step is, well, maybe this thing just isn't true. Maybe Christianity is just not true,
Yeah.
and I'm gonna lean towards the Mark Twain camp and just say, "You know what? I'm kinda checking out on faith. I don't wanna be taking part in believing something that I know isn't true." And then they just dip out on the capital F faith altogether. I've seen that happen time and time again, which is why, like, doctrine is so important. Like if going back to Phoenix's previous point, like if you read the scriptures and there's that passage where it talks about how God speaks those things that be not as though they were. But then in those particular circles, they just kind of take out the A part of the verse and just focus on that latter part. Like, see, you got to speak things that be not as though they were. And then
Mhm.
now you're getting into a space where, okay, well, I can't don't speak anything negative over me because it'll come to pass. I only can speak positive confessions and so forth. If that's how you're living
Yeah.
your life, and then eventually you run into some real suffering that that pseudo faith can't get you through, then a lot of people bail on God.
Mm.
So we really have to be careful how we
Yeah.
teach the scriptures. Like doctrine really matters. Exegesis really matters.
Mm.
Just for our spiritual health.
Yeah. Okay. So I said that was the last one, but I'm going to ask if blind faith is not the move we take, then what is? So, what does it look like to actually love God with your mind?
Again, I take it back to faithfulness. Like, God is not expecting us, to believe him just cuz. Like he gives us reasons to believe, right? And so I think that it's
Yeah.
it's a matter of when God gives you reason to believe something, that you exhibit faithfulness by taking him for what he for based upon the evidence that he's provided, right? I think a heart that
Sure. Yeah.
is doubtful is one where God has provided evidence and you choose to reject it. So God is telling us who he is. He's telling us what he's like. He's telling us, particularly through scripture, we're able to see, who he is, what he's like. We can look at, just the resurrection and know a whole lot about what God is up to, right? If you, in the face of that
Yeah.
evidence, you reject it, then yeah, I mean, you've taken a wrong turn somewhere. They don't have a heart disposition that rejects the evidence that God has provided. But I think faithfulness to the truth, faithful if you're going to be faithful, even just taking like faith out of the religious sense, just like looking at it from an epistemological sense. If you're faithful to pursue the truth wherever it leads, then I think that ultimately you can't do that in the face of evidence that God provides without affirming what it is that He's commending to us to believe. And so I think that faith is not something that's apart from evidence. I think that God provides evidence. I think there's evidence available all throughout creation as to God's existence. I think there's evidence that Jesus rose from the grave. I think just don't reject that evidence, and then follow and get to know the God that evidence points to.
Mm, yeah.
Yeah.
It's so silly to me to think that we can produce sufficient evidence that faith is no longer required. Like, it's not a one or the other. No apologist, no academic, no scholar is ever going to be able to provide you with so much evidence and argumentation and logic for God that faith is no longer required. I mean, God has set it up so that we can take people, kind of 95% of the way there in some cases, not for everyone, but you still have to take that step. Uh, Knowledge alone will not get you there, and we wouldn't be able to provide you with 100% knowledge anyway. So
Right.
it's so silly that people fear evidence as though it will compromise their faith or vice versa. It's like, no, the two go hand in hand.
Right. That's exactly how God made us.
I think that was really important because actually the flip side of that is true too. Like for atheists, they don't have certainty either. Like there's no atheist that can provide you with this airtight case that's unquestionable and has all the I's dotted, all the T's crossed, and where there's no considerations that lean against their natural perspective. That's not a real thing. Like that's just not the way
Mm,
we live in any area of our lives. Typically
Yeah.
we consider somebody to be rationally grounded if they have sufficient reason to affirm something, even if there are questions lingering out there that they may not be able to answer at that time. Like, you don't have to have certainty on all points of
Yeah.
one's position to have grounds to hold it. And so I think that if we're being intellectually honest, if I'm the atheist, then I should at least grant to the Christian that same wiggle room, if you will, that I would grant to myself. So I think that road goes both ways.
right.
That's
Yeah.
perfect. Yeah, I love it. That's exactly, yeah, that's the wrap up that I was going to give there as well, is just the kind of thing that we are as human beings. You've used epistemic from epistemology, the theory of knowledge. What can we actually know? What do we have epistemic access to? And it's not all knowledge. So you're never going to get to the level of a like understanding of the universe. And so, because of the kind of thing that you are, you need to have that epistemic humility, that I don't have access. It's not a God of the gaps. It's a realization of what you are as a human being who has a limited span of lifetime. You have a limited availability to study, those sorts of things. So, with the kind of thing we are, we're not going to have all those answers. So, it's a good point to make, Adam. Yeah, bouncing off of what Phoenix was saying. And you guys, I've got to wrap up the show. So, first of all, I want to thank you for joining me for this, because even though people have treated blind faith, I really feel like it just needs that constant conversation on it, because it's always being leveled at Christians,
Yeah.
from Christians and from non-Christians, that it is a blind belief, and it's good to have this out there so people can say, "Oh, okay, it's not, it's not a blind belief. That's just cultural cliche that's something that has arisen for various reasons in our time in history. And I love having this conversation with both of you. So thank you for being on the show today.
Had a blast.
Thanks for joining us on Weird Hill to Die On, where we firmly believe blind faith is bad theology. And Jesus never said, just trust me, bro. If this episode stirred something or made you laugh, share it, rate it, and send it to that friend who thinks Christianity means checking your brain at the door. And if you're feeling especially generous, consider giving us a little financial high five to keep these conversations rolling. As always, stay weird, stay curious, and don't stop thinking.